Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us today as part of our Wednesday lecture series at the Kennedy Center. This semester, as you know, our lecture series is on building and brokering peace, and we're so delighted today to welcome Professor Roger McGinty from from Durham University in the UK, and also from Northern Ireland. My name is Quinn Meekum. I direct our academic programs here at the Kennedy Center. We have a couple of announcements for you to be aware of. This week, tomorrow, 3 p.m. in this room, we're pleased to hear from Sonata Coulter. Sonata Coulter is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the U.S. Department of State, who oversees policy toward Russia and Central Europe. And she will be here speaking about U.S. policy toward Russia. Next week, also coming from Washington, D.C., we're pleased to welcome Stacia George. Stacia George will be speaking on the topic of finding common ground in polarized societies. Stacia is a long-standing conflict mediator. She directed the conflict resolution program at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and has, for the past 30 years, has essentially been working on conflict resolution, and currently spends a lot of time working on bringing U.S. hostages home from conflict regions. And so we really encourage you to come to that talk next Wednesday. Before I introduce our very distinguished speaker today, we'd like to invite Spencer Bennett to come and offer an opening prayer. Spencer is from Payson, Utah, majoring in international relations and economics. Come on up, Spencer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're very grateful for this day and for the opportunity to live here in Provo and for the opportunity to hear from such a distinguished speaker today. Lord, please bless us that we'll be able to understand more about how we might be peacekeepers and Christ-like diplomats in our own spheres because of what we hear today. And please bless us that we will be able to help others however we can. Please bless those who are struggling across the world, and please bless democracy in our country and throughout the world at this time. We love thee very much. We pray that we might be servants in thy hands and say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Spencer. For those of you that may be new to our lecture series, please find a calendar of events out on the table as you come in. Those are for you to take. I am really excited to introduce you to Roger McGinty. He's come to us all the way from Northern Ireland. And when you come from Northern Ireland and land in Provo, there's a little bit of culture shock, not least because Provo, in the Northern Ireland context, stands for the Provisional IRA. So he was telling me that as he walked around and saw the Provo florist, he was trying to get his mind around what that might actually look like in his home country. He is a professor in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University in England. Grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He has had a distinguished academic career. He leads a number of research initiatives. He's the co-founder of a research initiative called Everyday Peace Indicators, and he will be addressing some of our students this week on that project as well. He's also the editor of the journal Peacebuilding, and is the editor of an academic book series on peace studies as well. For 2025, he is the Distinguished Scholar for the Peace Studies section of the International Studies Association. And he's written in a number of places that get a lot of traction. He is cited by people all around the world in this particular field. He's been a visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame as well. And despite all of that amazing work and the fact that we found him because of his scholarship in writing, which is always a lovely thing to be able to do, his most famous moments have been viral Instagram moments. One is that he has two Labrador dogs, Ted and Bess. Bess went viral last year with over 1 million views, detecting a storm as it was on the horizon coming in as well. He has been retweeted by Ellen DeGeneres and one of the actors from Friends. We couldn't quite remember which one. During COVID, he said something to the effect of, now that my daughter is at home, I think that all public school teachers should receive £1 million salary, and it was a popular tweet. So we're going to go to 1 p.m. today. We'll also take a break before that for any of those of you who need to leave for classes, but please join me in welcoming Roger McGinty to BYU.
Thank you, Quinn, for such a generous introduction and reminding everyone that no matter what academic things I write, I'll never have the traction of a 9-second video of my dog's ears flapping in the wind. And thank you very, very much to the Kennedy Center for this invitation and for all of you for coming. I seem to have lost the clicker.
Make sure we find it. I'll find it.
Yeah. So it's really important that we talk about peace in times of conflict. And we try to dig beneath this word peace and see what it means. I think I can actually just press this possibly. Maybe not. Oh, it did change. Talks are rarely complete without technological problems. Okay, so let's begin with the one and only reference to a dead philosopher. Okay, I promise no more references. Gramsci said the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born, and it really does feel that we're in such a moment. Now, the next line from that quotation is that this is the time of monsters. I'm not so sure about monsters. Since I've become a grown-up, I haven't really seen many under the bed. But we really are in an interesting time, and it was interesting before you got a new president. These thoughts might be magnified by changes here, but actually they've been rattling around my head and many others' heads before that. So I want to start with what to many in the room might be some ancient history. Okay, this is way before many of you were born or had an interest in politics, but this stuff is important because in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the roadmap for modern peacemaking was set out. And what I want to do is tell the story about how that landscape of peace has changed since the 2000s, the early 2000s, and how this has massive implications for the world that we live in, the world that we're seeing unfolding before our eyes at the minute. So the late 1990s, the Cold War is over, and states and international institutions are trying to work out, what does this new world look like? How can we bring peace to conflicts that are breaking out? And we see the spread of UN peacekeeping missions. Peacekeeping missions are meant to separate warring parties. They're not meant to solve the problem, but it's time out in a way. And we see the spread of these missions. We see major peace processes in places like my own home country, but also in the former Yugoslavia, in the Middle East, in a number of African cases in Cambodia, leading to major peace accords. And with those peace accords come new settlements, new ways of government, of sharing power. We see truth and reconciliation commissions in which societies are attempting to come to terms with a violent past. We see those in a number of Latin and Central American countries, and perhaps most famously, we see one in South Africa. We see major international peace and reconstruction efforts with a lot of energy, including resources, being poured into reconstructing societies and cities physically, into economic regeneration, but also into, in a sense, into the spirit of how peace is to be made. And in a way, peace was cool. I don't know if the word cool is cool anymore, but peace was cool. It was one of those things in which, major celebs got on board the peace caravan and wanted to be associated with positive change in conflict-affected societies. And we saw world leaders use the language of peace, democracy, and human rights. So people like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair used that language. They at least bothered to engage intellectually in building a case for intervention. They talked about rights, they talked about democracy, they talked about peace. They used the word peace. We saw the massive expansion and professionalization of the peacebuilding sector, both within governments but also in the civil society sector. Civil society organizations, NGOs, did a lot of the heavy lifting in societies coming out of conflict. They helped in terms of lots of programs and projects on women's participation, on democracy, on good governance, and lots of other development projects. And we saw the building of a sector, of the peace-building sector, with its standard operating procedures, with its good practice. We saw a vernacular or a language of peace building. And crucially, we saw the recognition that negotiated settlements were possible and worth working for. This is absolutely crucial. There was an optimism. There was a sense that, yes, these conflicts are complex, but we can do something about it. I mean, take yourself back to the mid-1990s. Don't become traumatized by the music. Don't become traumatized by the fashion or the haircuts of that era. But try to take yourself back to the mid-1990s. And Bill Clinton attempted to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the Oslo Accords. I mean, that took optimism. That took confidence. That took a can-do attitude. Those really were different times. Think about the amount of optimism there is now, and that might be quite a short period of thinking. So this was a different era. It was often called the liberal peace. Now, the word liberalism has a peculiar meaning on this landmass that it doesn't have in the rest of the world, or indeed in political philosophy. So this liberal peace was the dominant form of international peace support intervention, and it was favoured by leading states, so the US, the UK, European Union, Australia, etc. And the reason it's called the liberal peace was it used the language of liberalism, classical liberalism, in terms of rights, individual freedoms, open markets, rule of law, and this optimism that actually, we can reform people and we can reform institutions. We can make life better. Now, the liberal peace was by no means perfect, and many of us have made a career out of criticizing it, including myself. It was uneven, it often was culturally inappropriate. Some people accused it of being illiberal and democracy at gunpoint. But it did save and improve many lives. Millions of displaced people were repatriated. I remember reading a newspaper. Remember the days there were newspapers, made out of paper? I saw a huge sign of civilization when I came into this building, in which there were copies of the New York Times, albeit ignored and gathering dust, but still I thought, wow, a newspaper. But anyway, I remember reading a newspaper, you know what I mean? Those big fold-out things, you'd find them in an archive or something. And there was this tiny little thing in a column on an inside page, and it said the 1 millionth person, IDP, internally displaced person or refugee, had been repatriated in the former Yugoslavia by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I mean, that's amazing. Think of the logistics. Think of the negotiations behind repatriating refugees. You've been ethnically cleansed from your town or your village in Yugoslavia. You've been displaced for a number of years, but then you go back home and you have to work out, is it safe? But think of the UN behind all of that and the immense amount of work. And this was happening all over the world. This was an era in which there were significant peace deals, many of them successful to a degree, others not so much. But it was an era of optimism. And I know it sounds like ancient history and it was a long time ago, but it's where, in a sense, our modern language and our thinking of peace comes from. Now, fast forward now, and frankly, I don't want to think about the fashion and I don't want to think about the hair of now, but I can talk about it in terms of politics. And we seem to be in an era of fragmentation. And it's worth asking the question, where does peace fit in this era of fragmentation? How can we define peace? Where does it sit in the current era? Well, we see rising levels of conflict, both the number of conflicts, but also the impact, quite frankly, the number of people who are killed in conflict. Those statistics are increasing, having declined over the past decade or so. We also see a declining relevance of the United Nations. The time was when everyone in this room would have instantly known the name of the Secretary General of the United Nations. I'm probably not alone in that I need to think for a second to remember the name of the UN Secretary General. So the UN has been declining in relevance. That's not the UN's fault. The UN is merely the sum of its parts. It's merely the sum of the states who make it up. So a number of states have been working very hard to sideline the UN. There are no new UN peacekeeping missions. And these missions work. There's lots of statistical evidence to show that UN peacekeeping actually works. It saves and improves lives. In fact, an indicator, in a sense, to the disregard that we have for UN peacekeeping is that 14 UN peacekeepers were killed last week in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Congratulations to anyone who found that on the news, because it was hidden. And remember, these people are working for all of us. The UN is the primary body charged for international peace and security. And also, there have been no major peace processes or peace accords recently. Probably the most significant major peace accord, the last most significant major peace accord, was in Colombia in 2016. So we're not really in an era of peace accords anymore, or an era of peace negotiations. And significantly, the language of peace isn't used by world leaders anymore. I said that, like them or loathe them, people like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair actually used the language of peace. They went to the bother of developing an intellectual scaffold for the activities they were engaged in. Have a look at some of the major foreign policy speeches by Joe Biden, for example. Doesn't use the word peace very much, doesn't use terms like democracy or human rights. These seem to have gone out of fashion. Instead, there's a major emphasis on stabilization and security. In fact, the mission in Afghanistan, the name was changed to an international stabilization mission. And when you think about it, to use a biomedical analogy, well, the patient is ill, let's stabilize them. Yeah, and then what? No, we're just going to stabilize them. No, but then what? No, nothing. So the sense of optimism, the sense that we can change things, the sense that we can intervene for the common good, the sense of human progress seems to have evaporated. And we're in an era of authoritarian conflict management in which we want to manage conflicts, not resolve them, not transform them, but to manage them. And, we're thinking of places like Yemen or activities by China or Russia or very, very many other states in which the aim is to manage the conflict, is to win militarily. There's no pretense of a negotiated outcome. There's no sense that we would negotiate with the other. There's no sense that, yes, we can reach an agreement with the other. Hence, there's a pessimism that there can be negotiated settlements. And the key, it strikes me, to peace is optimism, is the sense that you can change yourself, that you can, by negotiation, reach an accommodation with the other, that it is worth striving for some form of positive human development or change. And that optimism doesn't seem to be there anymore. So just to reinforce, we're in this era of increasing conflict. At the turn of the year, there were lots of conflict watch lists, many of them the usual suspects. But interestingly, we've got some there that we mightn't always identify. Mexico, Bangladesh being on the list. And we're in an era of changing conflict. There are lots of actions short of war. Things like cyber attacks, or certainly in Europe, there have been a lot of accidents with undersea cables and undersea pipelines. Shipping seems to be extremely poorly run, it would seem to me, or these aren't accidents whatsoever. These are malign actors engaging in actions short of war. And we see a lot of this in terms of cyber attacks and various actors scoping out cyber vulnerabilities. And whilst clearly this is being reported in what is done to us, you can bet your bottom dollar that it is being done to others from places like this or the landmass that I live on. Conflict also doesn't seem to have a definitive endpoint anymore. In a way, it never had, in the sense that, if you were injured or bereaved as a result of war, well, that war doesn't end. Those that are left standing still suffer. But there are no definitive endpoints in terms of peace accords. Those ceremonies of signing a document. And we also have warlike conditions in non-war contexts. So places like Honduras and Mexico, in which non-state actors are tooled up to the extent that they're armed as well as the state. And we're seeing very much, and I wrote this way before President Trump was re-elected for the second time, but we're seeing the fragmentation of the rules-based international order. Now, that rules-based international order worked for some and didn't work for others, but at least it was there. And that rules-based international order is pretty important. In all sorts of prosaic things that we take for granted. Now, when I mention rules-based international order, you might think that I'm thinking about human rights, that I'm thinking about the rules of law, the rules of war, and of course I'm thinking about that. But I'm also thinking about, things like air traffic control, World Health Organization, which the US has pulled out of. Fairly ordinary things that actually have a big impact on how we lead our lives. So there's been the fragmentation or the drawing back from the rules-based international order. We see alternative sources of power rising. China isn't rising. China has risen. Major power, second biggest economy in the world. But regionally, we see lots of other states rising and exercising their power and seeing the world not in a global sense, but just in a regional sense. We see the massive mobility of people, of ideas, of capital, of biohazards. We're in the most amazingly mobile world. And the example I use, people like me work really, really hard to take contemporary cultural references and throw them back at younger audiences to make their toes curl, okay? It takes a lot of effort for someone like me to do that. So, I just love with my own classes, talking about them being Swifties, and you see them all sort of, stiffening, their back stiffens, and half of them go, how dare you? And the other half are going, yeah, I'm a Swiftie, yeah. But when you think about it, Swifties and very, very many other forms of cultural identification are magnificently transnational. It doesn't matter if you're an American Swiftie or a Nigerian Swiftie or an Australian Swiftie, you're a Swiftie. Quinn is going, what's a Swiftie? I'll explain later. So we're in this era in which there's lots of cultural attachments that are post-national, that are post-state. I had a discussion with my own class last week, and I got them to draw a little map of themselves and situate themselves on the planet. And it was remarkable how many of them regarded themselves as post-national. Yeah, they had a passport. Yeah, they came from a particular country. But, they were international students. They were not studying in the country they came from, and for their master's degree, they would go to another country, and they were bilingual. And I think this is accelerating. And this is absolutely crucial to the world that we're living in. Obviously, climate change has massive impact on how we're going to live, and also this issue of tech governance. Issues of governance, international governance, have always been important, but the key difference, I think, for this era and for your generation, and it's something that you guys are really going to be dealing with for the next decades, is that the power players in this are private corporations who won't have any qualms about offshoring, about deterritorializing, about becoming hyper-mobile with your data. So we're living in an era of fragmentation, of great uncertainty. This is just an example of currency exchanges just going up and up and up. This is merely the number of SWIFT exchanges per day. It's not the amount, but there's one direction of travel here. So what does peace look like in our current era? Well, who are the peacemakers? Well, look at the list. Qatar, UAE, China, Turkey, African Peace Mission. And all of these have a story to tell, a story about making peace, but also there are stories that can be told about them in terms of human rights, of involvement in ongoing conflict. So, Qatar, extraordinarily wealthy, a oil and gas rich, very small state, very active in mediation, was the principal mediator between Hamas and Israel over the past 15, 16 months, and really making a difference. So for the World Food Programme to get its trucks into Gaza, negotiations had to be held. Israel isn't going to talk directly with Hamas. Someone has to mediate. Someone has to bring parties together. And I'm not talking about bringing an end to that conflict. I'm talking about simply feeding people, getting water to people. So Qatar, who have been involved in multiple mediation efforts around the world in recent years. You may remember in the Russian-Ukrainian war that the Russians had seized territory, and with that territory had seized lots of children who became separated from their Ukrainian parents. And it was Qatar who engaged in the negotiations for those children to be repatriated. United Arab Emirates, its interventions in the Russian-Ukrainian war have become so regularized that there are now big number, monthly prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. These are lives saved. These are lives improved. This really is making a difference. And it's the UAE who's doing it. China, as a peacemaker, well, last time I checked in the most recent figures, China contributed 1,800 troops to UN peacekeeping missions. The United States, with its massive military, contributed 27 troops. You know, they could fit into this room, and there would be quite a lot of room as well for others. China is increasingly engaged behind the scenes in scoping out mediation efforts for the Russian-Ukraine war. Very interesting that the Ukrainian foreign minister, the Ukrainian government in the early years of that dreadful conflict had ignored China and had been looking to the West for assistance. Very interesting, over the summer, the Ukrainian foreign minister goes to Beijing in recognition that no peace will be made in that war unless the Chinese are involved in some way. Turkey, also hugely involved in peace missions. 2 summers ago, there was the African peace mission to Ukraine and Russia. Moscow and Kiev certainly did not want the African peace mission. They found it embarrassing. This was a group of African leaders who went to try to broker peace. And it was roundly criticized with comments like, what do these people know? You know, stay in their lane. What do these African guys know about Ukraine or Russia? They've got problems at home. Why don't they deal with those? And it's funny because those criticisms were exactly the same that had been made against the European Union and the United States and the UN and many other interveners. So there is a lot of peace work going on, but it's not from what I might call the usual suspects. It's not Western in the sense of from this landmass or European. It doesn't come from that sort of Anglo-European philosophical tradition. It doesn't come from a Christian tradition either. Of course, the legacy peacemaking system is still there, but it's limping along. But it's being gutted, underfunded, has had a crisis of confidence, and has changed in recent years. So it's worth asking, well, what are the methods that these new or so-called new peacemakers are using? It's mainly mediation, very, very quiet, behind-the-scenes mediation, very patient. It's not focused on a deal. It's not focused on the big signing ceremony. Instead, it's about getting things done. but it tends to be humanitarian rather than political. In other words, it's about saving and improving lives, but not necessarily going for the big peace deal, not going for solving the conflict. It involves pragmatic coalitions, unusual partners getting together just on one theme rather than permanently. So what does all of this mean for peace? What are the implications for peace? Well, for me, peace is a verb as well as a noun. In other words, it's how you do it patterns what it is. Okay? It doesn't really matter what you say you're doing. It matters what you do. As part of my research, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. And many of those people, all of those people have been very, very generous in giving me time. But most of them have just lied to me and told me absolute rubbish what I wanted to hear. And I've learned, and that's their perfect right. You take someone's time to interview them, they can tell you about anything. That's absolutely fine. But I've learned it's not what people say, it's what they do. And it's the same with peace. It's not what people say, it's what they actually do. So it's what form does peace make? What form does peace take? And therefore, we need to watch these new peacemakers, see what they do, and that becomes peace. Because the field of play has been left. The US, the UK, the European Union have withdrawn from this field. And nature can't stand a vacuum. So others are stepping in to this peace field. And once they're there, and once they're doing their thing, they are making peace. And this peace tends to be humanitarian. It emphasizes security and stability. It doesn't reach for the major peace accord. I don't think the Qataris or the folks from the UAE have read The Art of the Deal. And they're fine with that because they're making their own deals, very incremental deals. But they don't talk about rights or representation. And I think that's quite troubling from someone who grew up, or at least who was politicized or acculturated to these peace accords of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And this peace isn't rooted through the UN or regional bodies. It's often very much linked to regional politics in showing off, well, I'm the top dog in my region. It's about one-off deals rather than constructing a system of peacemaking. So each one is bespoke in a sense, each one is unique, but there's no sense of, hey, let's build a new international system like the UN or a reformed UN. And it tends to avoid much of the existing peace architecture. So there are lots of mediation organizations in which people really are twiddling their thumbs because they are not being called upon. Instead, these new peacemakers are doing the mediation for them. Now, over the summer, or what passed as a summer in Ireland, it was just a different sort of rainy season, added to the rest of the rainy seasons. I interviewed by Zoom 30 really experienced peacemakers. These are people who have been working in this field for at least 2 decades. And there were 2 schools of thought on the so-called new peacemakers. One was there's a binary of the West and the rest doesn't want to play the game anymore. In other words, Western states have lost the dressing room. No one's going to listen to them when they talk about peace. So there was a sort of fear, in a sense, or a frustration. No one's listening anymore. But also there was a feeling that the new actors could be a tremendous resource, that actually they have access that we don't have. They have a language that we don't have. They've got a patience that we don't have. So does any of this matter? And particularly, I've only been here about 24 hours, but I've noticed you guys are surrounded by mountains. You know, you could probably live perfectly well here, isolated. Well, actually, I think it does matter. I think that how we make peace on the rest of the planet matters to everyone. I think the day after matters in the sense that if peace is made, then how people live the rest of their lives as productive citizens, as members of the global economy, the global political economy, matters for all of us. And if conflicts are to end, we want them to stay ended. So the sustainability of peace is important, and therefore the quality of peace is important. The better the peace, the greater the chance of it lasting. And also in our hugely connected world, full of Swifties and other transnationally located people, there's a huge link between conflict and how we lead our lives. It impacts on our own mobility, on global economic instability, supply chain, environmental degradation. All of that really matters. You know, as someone who lives in Europe, the war in Ukraine really impacted on fuel prices, on the economy, on the route that flights take. I went to Doha recently. I went to Japan last year. And flights skirt around the region. That's an extra 2 hours of your life. That's an increased airfare. All of this really matters to how we lead our lives. Okay, let me end really quickly in an attempt to be optimistic. Many of the essentials of the international system remain in place. For how long, I'm not sure, but it's a good thing. The international humanitarian system is actually very sophisticated. They've really grabbed the data revolution. It doesn't solve problems, but it matters. If you need to get protein to people who are starving, we now have the technology to do that quickly. Politics is another thing. There's a much better understanding of the linkages between humanitarianism, development, and peace building. We might see an end to the war in Ukraine this year, which is good for everyone. And we're also seeing, I think, a reconfiguration of the international system. I mean, it's crazy that the UN Permanent Five is based on the outcome of World War II. You know, hello? The world has changed. And it's not a bad thing if we have that reconfiguration to reflect changes. And with these new peace actors, I think we've got new opportunities. We're seeing new forms of peace being made in front of our eyes. And that's pretty exciting. And in a sense, a lot of states only have themselves to blame. If they leave the field, other people are going to go on to it. So let me finish there, and thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. That was so rich, and we have so much to talk about, and we've got 15 minutes to do it in. We invite you to join us in conversation with Professor McGinty. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We have Kimball and Marabella with microphones in the back. They'll bring you a microphone. Please wait for the microphone to reach you. Stand. Tell us your name and what you study, if you're a student here at BYU. If you do need to leave in advance for a 1 o'clock class, you're also welcome to do that. But we invite you into this conversation. And I'm going to take advantage of the podium for just a moment and ask the first question. The new actors that you highlight must be doing something right if there's a market for their services. I'm wondering what you think they might be getting right and what traditionally Western peacekeeping actors might learn from that if they want to get back into this game, as you describe it. Thanks.
That's a great question. What they're getting right, quite a different approach. They're not associating or attaching conditions to their peacemaking. Now, that's problematic for someone like me in the sense that often conditions associated with peacemaking were associated with things like democracy and human rights. But maybe those are things you have to give up to get prisoners released, to get children repatriated. I think also a crucial difference is one of timeline. There's something in the sort of Western business psyche in which we want a deal and we want a deal now, and we set a deadline, and we all have to dance to that deadline. So there's something about temporality about the new actors in that they've got immense patience, and I think that is a huge difference, and that actually works. It's a key piece of cultural understanding that conflict parties have taken on board. Okay, we're not being forced to make a deal here. We can make that according to our own timeline. Again, problematic because everybody every right-minded person would want a peace deal sooner rather than later. But if people aren't ready for it, it's not going to happen. And also access. I was really struck. I was in a meeting absolutely packed with peace builders in DC in September. Maybe about 200 people in the room, mediators. And someone asked the question, who's working on Sudan? Now, Sudan is the most violent conflict on our planet at the moment. It's killing more people than any other conflict. And there was silence. No one was working on Sudan. And I think one of the problems with a lot of peacemaking from Western sources is that it's working on the low-hanging fruit, on the easy cases, rather than the tricky ones. And I think some of the new actors have been working on the really tricky conflicts. But other questions and comments, welcome.
So I'm an American Studies major. My name is Tayton Fuja. I'm wondering what's your opinion on possible normalization of Saudi relations with Israel. This was discussed the other day at a press conference between President Trump and President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I'm interested to see what your take is on that.
I mean, it's a region in flux. There's a lot going on, and I have a feeling that the Saudis will take something from the Trump playbook. Trump's style to negotiation is before the negotiation happens, you put down a condition. You unsettle your opponent before you negotiate. And I think the Saudi. I was in Doha last month and I was talking to a number of people, and their sense was that the Saudis would say we're open to normalization, but there has to be a recognition of Palestine for that to happen. It's very difficult to tell. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. It's not in any way representative. There's not a sense of we'll take soundings from our from our citizens. MBS, the ruler, has absolute power, and he likes doing deals, actually. So I genuinely don't know, but I do know in the region the anger in relation to the war in Gaza is real and palpable, and a number of regimes are not as secure as their leaders would want them to be. So they have to be quite sensitive to public opinion. But it's a region in immense flux, and President Trump's statement yesterday is not going to. That is not a salve. That is not going to calm many opinions in the region. It might make some people very happy, but it's not going to make a lot of others happy as well.
Hi, I'm Mary Teal. I'm studying public health. And I was just wondering, you talked about some of these new actors. And in cases where countries like South Africa are asking for veto power in the UN Security Council, do you think it's realistic that Western actors will make room for them?
No. I don't. But to me, one of the interesting things. So There are 5, just in case anyone doesn't know, there are 5 states who have veto power. They're permanent members of the 15-member UN Security Council. And they're not going to give up their power. But I think there's something quite interesting going on, and that is a number of states have realized that actually we don't want to be on the UN Security Council with a permanent seat. Somewhere like India is seeing itself as a regional top dog, and if it's on the UN Security Council, with that comes quite a bit of responsibility. Regional responsibility, international, but also regional responsibility to intervene. And it's probably making a calculation. We're a big state. We've got a lot of muscle. We actually don't need the hassle and the bother of this. Yes, we can engage in the rhetoric of, hey, you guys, you need to be fair, because that, allows us to say it's still a colonial world, it's still, a world of the haves and the have-nots, etc. But I think some states are making a clever calculation that actually the UN has declining utility. We've got to where we've gotten without being a member of the UN Security Council. We can make strategic partnerships with China and with others without the UN. So why take on this extra responsibility? It's a good stick to beat the UK, France, and others with, including the US. But actually, all that responsibility? Nah.
I'm Lamont Tuller. I'm studying political science, and I was curious. A lot of the new actors you're talking about, would classify them as having a lot of human rights issues themselves. Mm-hmm. But how do you think that plays into them, promoting human rights or not promoting human rights around the world?
All states, with possible exception of, Sweden and Switzerland, don't have perfect stories to tell. All states have issues with exclusion, with minorities, etc., etc. And no state likes anyone else telling a story about it which reflects poorly on it. These states just don't talk about rights. It just isn't on the agenda in the sense of individual freedoms, of human rights from a sort of European legal tradition. Many of these are authoritarian states. They're ruled by families. They're monarchies. They have altered their constitutions to perpetuate that rule. So they just don't talk about it. And in a sense, there's a certain pragmatism there, as I mentioned earlier. If you load a peace deal with so many justice requirements, with so many rights for minorities, it might make it so unattractive that no one's going to sign up for it. That tension between peace and justice. So I think we are moving into a world in which human rights have become very unfashionable. And, it's one of those things that is unspoken. It's not part of the deal. No, you don't get rights. No, you don't get legal protections. What you get is an end to violence, and you can lead your lives, but you don't get a slate of rights with that.
Hi, my name is Matt Johnston. I'm also studying political science. With traditional systems and programs being dismantled like USAID, how do you kind of see a way forward for individuals to get involved? Do you see a shift into the private sector, like public nonprofits, or how do you kind of see a way forward in this field?
I think that's a really great question. There has been a huge professionalization of the conflict response sector, with many organizations becoming established, many very respected, very good, very professional organizations. So I think that that is a route. What I would say is that USAID actually, a huge portion of its money stayed in the United States already and funded for-profit peacebuilding organizations or peace organizations, mainly headquartered in DC. What I've noticed with my own students over the past decades, I'm afraid to say, is that many of them actually make their own jobs. And by that I mean they begin working in an organization that works on rights or development or peace building. But once they get into that job, they realize, actually, I could be more useful if I did something else. You know, it would be better for my particular skill set. So I think there still will be opportunities there for people with the skill set, with the motivation, with the ability to travel and do all of those things. But I think the announcements over the past couple of days certainly don't help. And I saw on social media a comment from a wonderful former student that I had, who's American, who said, and who did multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And she said, I find it highly offensive that my work has been described as dumb and all sorts of other things. And I think people like her, who really have given a big portion of their life for human progress, I think they must be severely wounded at the minute. Sorry, just one other point. These new actors, I think, also will be welcoming people from other places to help them understand the world as well.
Last week we had Patrick Mason come and speak, and he talked about kind of the layers and the nuances of what peace means. You've spoken about kind of peace between nations, an end to international conflicts, as well as an end to kind of societal perpetuations of violence via human rights violations. Recently I had a conversation with a family that works for the State Department, and they kind of described some of the resistance to the U.S.'s efforts to push kind of more human rights and equality-based programs in the nations that they've been stationed. How do you balance those things? Because where we're trying to achieve peace on so many different levels, but also to some degree, the Western world has this kind of more advanced idea of nonviolence and well, we have some Westerners, I should say, have this idea that human rights are important, but not necessarily. That's something that's developed in the West and in certain spheres of existence, but not all. So where we're working with cultures that are different and nations that have different priorities. How do you strike that balance between respecting where people are right now in terms of human rights and equality, and trying to progress, humanity forward?
I think that's a brilliant question. And 2 weeks ago, I had the great pleasure with one of my classes. We had a Skype. We had a Zoom conversation with she's actually an American citizen who works for the United Nations in Kabul. And we were discussing the issue of women and girls having access to education. And for someone like me, I just think it's absolutely obscene that women and girls don't have access to education. And her take was actually really interesting, I thought. And she's worked in Afghanistan, I think, for 12 years. So, she knows the context very well. And she was saying a number of things. One, to echo what you said, we need to work where we are rather than where we want to be. And she said, the Taliban actually is quite a broad coalition. And the worst thing that we can do is make this an issue here. And then the Taliban, which ultimately is quite nationalistic as well as being religious, the Taliban feel, under pressure and their backs to the wall. Look what these Westerners want us to do. And therefore they become quite oppositional to it. And she said some of and this is not a term that is used often, but some of the more liberal Taliban were saying, actually, if you back off from this, they will actually change. It's going to take time, but they will. Now then, come back to us, to the people in this room. That's a really difficult one, because who are we to say, okay, this generation can miss out on schooling, but maybe the next one will have that access. So, welcome to the world of a tortured liberal, in which the trade-off between justice and peace is never, going to be perfect. But I think it's very good to listen to the local, and we need better systems of doing that for us as outsiders to interpret the real dynamics of what's happening in other countries. For example, these tensions or divisions within the Taliban.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. One more round of applause.
Well, thank you. Thank you.